Okay. So we're going to have, in just a second, we're going to have the laboratory director, Chuck Shank, give us some remarks to start us off. But before we do that, I would like to, before I forget it, give acknowledgments to some people who really have worked very hard for this event. First, I'd like to thank Maggie Pinkert and Greg Holman for the music. And then there are three people that can take credit for almost everything you see here, for arranging the food and the posters and just about everything. They worked very hard against impossible deadlines and the usual impossible obstacles to overcome. And so that's Barbara Alquist and Joyce Cordell and Julia Turner. They're right over here. And with that, we'll turn it over to Chuck.
Well, I'd like to congratulate this division on its 30th birthday. But in many ways, the division and many of its incredible accomplishments, both for the state, and for the country, and for the planet, there is something more that this division has done in addition to that I thought I would begin my remarks with. 30 years ago, this laboratory was a laboratory that ran some machines and had a glorious history of accomplishment, numerous Nobel Prizes, and it was shortly after I arrived here, I received a book that had been written by a Berkeley faculty member about Lawrence and his laboratory. And essentially that book said that the laboratory was over when the Fermilab was built, and that was the end of this laboratory and the end of its future. And he wrote that volume 1, and he prided himself that he had not talked to anybody, which made it a very good book. And the amazing thing is that I had come to this laboratory, and it was in 1989, and the Fermilab construction had been well before that, and many things had happened to the laboratory. But he wrote volume 1, and he was going to write volume 2 that really reaffirmed the fact that the lab was dead, and he didn't get an opportunity to write that book. But what happened 30 years ago was there are very few occasions when a lab director can have such an extraordinary influence on a lab, and it's when Andy Sessler worked with his antecedents here, who created this division. And in creating this division, he created the lab that we have today. He created the opportunity for us to take the strengths and the skills that had created this wonderful era of scientific accomplishment. He attracted some of our brilliant high-energy physicists who came and created this new field and made the kind of changes that are now legendary, things that you all need to be proud of, and many of you who have been here all that time, and many of you who came here after, certainly appreciate that. I appreciate what this division has done for the laboratory and its vitality and strength, and how it grew, collapsed, got real tough and hung in there, and grew some more, and multiplied its impact with the activities that you are all famous for. I think that looking to the future, that future is really dependent upon and it gives thanks to the clear thinking of Andy Sessler and the precedents of the people who created this division. And our opportunities are extraordinary, and we look to the future both for the laboratory and for the things that will happen in the division. It's interesting when I go to other laboratories who are about 30 years behind us. And I was recently in Germany at the DAISY laboratory, and they're about to turn off their HERA experiment, which is a big high-energy physics experiment. And following that, they're going to have a laboratory that looks a lot like what we looked like 30 years ago. And so they asked me, well, how did this happen? And I said, well, for starters, maybe you ought to talk to Andy Sessler, because he was the guy that really had the vision that laid the ground to create the laboratory what it is today. And so I thank you for your 30 years of accomplishments, and I thank you for the 30 years that you gave us to build the new, exciting, vital laboratory that we have today. And you all deserve a great birthday. So thank you so very much.
We're now going to back up a little bit because I forgot to introduce myself, although I think I know most of the people here. I'm Don Grether, and it's my privilege to have introduced Chuck Shank and also the rest of today's speakers. I've been in a division almost but not quite back at the start in this time of the year 1973. Perhaps because of my longevity, when people don't know quite what to do with something concerning the division, they usually send it to me. And so a couple of years ago, the archives office at the laboratory delivered to my office 6 boxes of records, boxes about yay big, that exceeded some statute of limitations or other, so archives was no longer willing to look at them or keep them. Well, it was always on my list of things to do to open those boxes and see what was inside, but I never quite managed to do it until very recently when this event was coming up, and I figured I'd finally better do it. Now, there were lots of things in there like manuals for computers of the 1970 era, pretty much of a useless thing. But among the sort of historic debris, there was a treasure trove of documents for the early 1970s, the couple of years leading up to the division, the establishment of the division, and slightly thereafter. So far, I've made it through about 4.5 of the 6 boxes. And what I'm going to do is present you just a very few samples of what was in there that I found. It gives an indication of the ferment leading up to the establishment of the division and how some things have changed and some other things around here have changed very little in the last 30 years. The first is a memo dated April 20th, 1970, and it's from Andy Sessler. And it's to the Environmental Science Research Screening Committee. And what they were being asked to do was look over a number of ideas that people had come up with over the course of a couple months earlier. In fact, there's now a sign-up list for some meeting or other back in January of 30th, 1970. And I'm not going to read all these to you, but there's some that are interesting for historic reasons. There's Art Rosenfeld, who was proposing to do work on auto emission monitoring. Now, many of us associate Art with buildings, but in fact his first interest was in and long-standing interest is in automobiles. There's another one from Roland Armour, who many of us may remember, electric vehicles and the coordination of battery research, where we're still working on battery research and we're still waiting for those electric vehicles 30 years later. Here's one from Bob Burge. Bob is here. I want to raise his topic is interested. Now, that's not very specific, but the reason that I invited Bob here is he was the director of the physics division at the time when energy and environment was being formulated. I, plus a number of other people here, were in the physics division at the time, and I've always been grateful to Bob to giving me the opportunity to make the transition from physics to the energy and environment division back in 1974. Another one is, well, let's see, I think that's, no, there's some that are very topical even today, like there was a proposal from Robert Rydell on worldwide climate and computational modeling. That's certainly something very timely today. And one by Andy Sessler on computational model for local area smog forecasting, something that the division is still very interested in all these years later. The next one is entitled LBL Energy and Environment Program by, it's a write-up by Jack Hollander and Andy Sessler, both of whom are here and will speak in a minute. And what they're proposing is that this fairly loosely organized activity should be coalesced into a program. At that time, it was called the Energy and Environment Program. They made it very clear that it was not yet a division. That was to come a year and a half later. The next one is a editorial from Science Magazine dated June 16th, 1972. And actually, the text here is very modern because it speaks of how important energy is to the nation and how we really have to focus on doing something about it. At that time, the laboratory was under the auspices of the Atomic Energy Commission, not the Department of Energy. And I'm only going to read to you the last paragraph. It says, "No other agency of the federal government is in a more favorable position to launch a unified program for meeting the energy needs of the American people than is the Atomic Energy Commission. It should be transformed into the U.S. Energy Agency." And the author of the editorial was Glenn Seaborg. Next is a write-up by Jack in November of 1972 to sort of follow up on that. Conversations with Atomic Energy Commission and National Science Foundation people, sort of a record of his trip. He talked to a particular commissioner at the AEC about the AEC becoming the energy agency, and it turned out it was a little premature. The quote is, "We are maintaining a low profile while trying to get new programs started." And eventually the Atomic Energy Commission did transform into the Department of Energy, but it was many years later. Next is actually a little bit after the division was officially formed in July of 1974, called Energy and Environment Division, Projects, Investigators, and Program History. I'm not going to go through all this, but there's some that I found interesting. One is under combustion processes, the fundamental studies in combustion. At that time, the spokesperson was Tony Oppenheim. Certainly, fundamental studies in combustion continues to this day. Another one was gas particle interactions and aerosol chemistry. Teacher Novikov teaches here somewhere. Still working on gas particle interactions and aerosol chemistry, although it's made a lot of progress over the years. Another one is solar heating and cooling system, Mike Wallach and others. Mike's here. Mike started up the solar program way back then. Next one is measurement of circumsolar radiation by Mike Wallach and Don Grether. That was my entree into the division, and there's a picture out there in the entryway of me and a guy by the name of Dave Gumbs and the circumsolar telescope. There's one which some of you will remember, like Mike will remember for sure, and Bob Budnitz, the Nightingale engine, Paul Hernandez, and Ridgway Banks. Then there's one that on Tormac confinement experiments, M. Levine. Now, I don't think that Mark Levine was ever involved in Tormac. Was it Mort? Mort Levine. Yes. Advanced instrumentation, survey of instrumentation for environmental monitoring, air, water, radiation, and biomedical. Dick Mack. Dick Mack is here, way back in the back. Now, although his name is associated with this, and there are lots of other people that are involved, that was an entree into the division for lots of people like Bob Budnitz and Craig Hollowell and a number of others. Finally, the division is working with the Earth Science Division is getting more involved in the so-called energy-water connection, and it turns out there's nothing new. Back in those days, there was it Evelofting? Yeah. Nevada Water Resources. Another one on studies of water resources and utilization for the California Department of Water Resources. So again, we're still doing a lot of that same work. Then the next has to do with Ev Lofting, who was prominent in the division and the lab back in those early days. It's a memo of June 1973, June 22nd, and it says, very brief memo, the LBO Parking Committee has not granted your request for Blue Triangle parking privileges for Dr. Lofting. So parking is an issue then, parking is an issue now. We're still arguing over Blue Triangle permits.
Who was that memo to?
Actually, it was the memo was to James Baker, who was the head of mathematics and computing at the time.
Later became a presidential advisor.
There you go. And then finally, this very nice document, which is undated and has no author, but because of several things that are written in here, it had to be written in about 1973 or 1974. The title is Energy Research Laboratory. says the Energy and Environment Division has grown rapidly since its inception. The staff and the equipment for these programs are now scattered through 18 buildings at the laboratory. The scattering of personnel throughout the laboratories made it difficult to provide a cohesiveness of program direction, limited the daily contact, and so on. So the proposed Energy Research Laboratory would bring together most elements of the division, now scattered throughout the laboratory, would relieve the severe overcrowding anticipated by the rapid growth of the new programs of the division. There is even a artist conception of what the building would look like. Pardon? That was Mel Simmons? Okay. And it would have been located just on the other side of to the back of the cafeteria. Well, it didn't happen. And of course, the situation has not changed. We're still scattered in at least 18 buildings, maybe more. Have the same problems and the same very logical reason as to why the funding agency should build a building for us. We've made a number of attempts, both when Elton Cairns was a division director and more recently under Mark's auspices, and we're still where we were before. Lots of books, lots of problems, and no building. What I want to now do is turn this over to the people that were really instrumental in the division, first at the beginning and then more recently. First, Stanley Sessler, who we've already mentioned in several contexts. He had a distinguished career in accelerator physics. He became the laboratory director in this time 30 years ago. And he's been involved in a number of humanitarian causes over the year and was the president of the American Physical Society for 1998. So, Andy, here you go.
Thank you. The start of this division was very modest indeed. Really just a thought. Although at that time a rather radical thought. It's hard to believe that it was radical, but it was in those days. A thought that came out of, well, had been reading the Sand Hill Almanac and Silent Spring and a good number of other items. And I was mixing my political beliefs with my science, which is something I've done ever since, work on arms control and things like that. It seemed to me, those many years ago, that many strengths of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory should be applied not exclusively to pure science, but also to the pressing environmental problems associated with our living on the Earth. So I discussed this matter with a senior and sympathetic member of the theoretical physics group, namely Ken Watson, and we decided to send a memo to a few friends, inviting them to discuss the ideas in the theoretical conference room one afternoon. I was at that time, I still am, a theoretical physicist, but at that time I had absolutely no experience in administration. All right, so a number of people showed up, I would say about 20, and particular interest, namely a willingness to work, was expressed by Jack Hollander and Dick Mack. So we had a chemist, an engineer, and a physicist, and that seemed like a good way to get going. We put our thoughts on paper, produced an outline of various projects that LBL might engage in. That first book, the Yellow Book, and I don't even have a copy of this great historic document, became our guide as we progressed towards a program. Our very initial thoughts were to reach out to the campus and bring into LBL collaborations with the very many, very talented campus faculty. So we were spending a great deal of time, actually, on campus, and some of that worked. Look at the Earth Science Division, and some came to naught. Soon, somehow, the three of us, and Jack as a chemist would probably know how it was done, we had a set of offices and a full-time secretary in the chemistry building. Real support came from Glenn Seaborg and Earl Hyde, both no longer with us. I would say that Ed McMillan was encouraging, but he was certainly wary of our venture. Later, he made us an Office of Environmental Science. We actually wanted to be a division, but he didn't allow that, which, having no official status, wouldn't cause any trouble with the Regents or the AEC. And I could tell from later days some stories about interaction with Regent Catherine Hurst and her very negative views on environmental research, but some other time. One of our first jobs was to convince the National Science Foundation to support our efforts. Since what we were attempting to do was outside the AEC mission. It was essential to get NSF support, but NSF had never supported an AEC laboratory. So Joel Snow was the person at the NSF who really made it happen, and it was crucial to the start of this division, actually. Our very first success was a survey of instruments, and Dick Mack actually showed me the book that we have, LBL-1, on this subject. That allowed us for the first time to get in some real money and real hires, and I think that Bob Budnitz came under that, joined us at that time, as was mentioned. In due course, a large number of our initial proposals, I think 10 out of 12 of them were funded, and we were off and running. Jack can tell you more and with more precision about those early days. Sometime later, I moved into the front office, and I was able to establish the division, which I did on my very first day 30 years ago. Naturally, in good political tradition, but actually for more substantive reasons, I made Earl Hyde deputy director and Jack Hollander director of this division. Later, I was able to appoint to the division Bob Budnitz and then Elton Kearns. Well, I could spin more yarns about those times than you care to hear. Those early days were quite interesting and insightful, such as Hadeshi's work on mercury and tuna fish, and maybe Jack will talk about that because it was under his watch. I limit myself to one story, and that's a story that has implications even for the present time. Shortly after the division was formed, a report was issued about conservation of energy, and that if it was implemented, it would have preclude the further construction of a number of power plants. Soon that report was noticed by the Energy Research and Development Administration, which at that time was our primary funding agency. Consistent with their name, they were all for developing energy and not conserving it. And they got very angry, really very angry. And they insisted that all reports from LBL should first be shown to people at the ERDA and approved by them. Well, that was a contractual matter. It had to do with the independence of the contracting university and even a matter of free speech. So how could a university operate with a federal government censoring its opinions? I immediately went to the president of the university and got his backing for fighting. I fought hard, and the compromise, in quotation marks, because I think I won, was that we have a system within the laboratory for reading reports, and that ERDA would keep out of it. Well, having a system for reading internal reports, that's only a sensible thing. Nobody can be against that. So I think the result of that argument, and it was essential to stand up to the funding agency and do that despite what one might worry about getting more money and so on. Well, enough for stories. I have been fortunate to be at the lab more than 2 decades since I left the front office, and thus I've been able to watch and note what is passing, perhaps of great importance at the time, but still passing, and what has remained and grown. Well, I think of the trees I had planted at the Bevatron Circle so as to block the ugly view of the Bevatron external beam area. Well, the trees I planted at the U-turn just as you enter the lab, which you can look at as you drive in each morning, and serves as a break between the chaos and bustle of the city and the day ahead. These trees have remained and grown wonderfully. And just like those trees, this division has remained and grown wonderfully. Both have been wonderful to watch. So let me look to the future rather than talk about history 25, 35 years ago. Clearly it is rosy, for the importance of your work is now widely appreciated. And as we all well know, it is as much needed now as it was then. So congratulations to you, and I look forward to ever more things in the future. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Jack Hollander. As already Andy mentioned, Jack was the first division director, but he only was here in that position for about 2 years, and then he took a leave to go to to head up a national study, a study for the National Academy of Sciences called CONEUS, which stood for Committee on Nuclear and Alternative Energy Systems, which is one of the most, if not the most, comprehensive study of that type that's ever been done. Since then, he's had a number of high-level positions. He was the vice president of research at Ohio State, the first director of what is now called the University of California Energy Institute, and he's the author of a recent and provocative book entitled The Real Environmental Crisis: Why Poverty, Not Affluence, is the Environment's #1 Enemy. Jack?
Well, thank you very much, Don. Well, first, I'd just like to add my congratulations to those you've already received to the lab and to the division for its first 30 years. I hope the next 30 years are equally productive as the last. Andy Sessler has already mentioned some of the background of the division, and not knowing exactly what he was going to say, I also would like to reflect a little bit on that. As Don mentioned, I was division head for only 2 years, but really the genesis of the division itself took it took 6 years. So if you add those two, it was really 8 years, not 2 years. And the beginning of this was this famous meeting that Andy talked about. He mentioned that Ken Watson called this. I had assumed, I think Andy had a big role in calling that meeting together in Building 50. And as Andy said, several dozen physicists, chemists, and engineers attended that meeting, and the purpose was to explore whether the lab's high-tech approach to science and technology might make some contribution to the environmental problems of the day. There was a lot of discussion in that meeting, but there was no unanimity as to what should happen. Some attendees felt strongly that the lab should not go off in this tangent, but should stick to its knitting, stick to areas of expertise which were already in the lab, stick to what made the solid track record of the lab and what gave the lab all those Nobel Prizes. Others at that meeting felt differently, felt that the lab's unique analytical skills, which were developed largely for work in nuclear chemistry and physics, might be ideally suited to tackle some of the difficult analytical problems that were related to pollutants in the environment, which trace analysis was one of the main challenges of the day. The majority at that meeting did favor the latter approach, and Andy, as he said, was encouraged to take the next step. The next step didn't come exactly as he mentioned, however. It wasn't automatic. Andy and I talked about 2 weeks after that meeting, and he told me, he said, well, no one has stepped forward to assume responsibility for developing such a program. My response was, okay, I'll do it if you assist me. And Andy said that he would, and he did. He did then and for many years afterwards. And Andy assisted with his tremendous enthusiasm and his legendary pragmatism, and that's what got it going. I'd like to say, just as an aside, 1968 was a pivotal year for me as well as for millions of other people, because we had, before this meeting, a few months before, we had just witnessed, I'm sorry, we didn't personally witness, we had just experienced the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, for whose presidential primary campaign I had actually worked for several months. Along with so many others, I felt for at least a month after that a tremendous malaise. I asked myself, what am I doing this wonderful, physics, having fun, and whereas the society is in such terrible trouble as it really was in the middle of 1968. So I resolved that I would like to do something to give back something to society more than just the research work that I was doing at the lab. And it was just about the time, almost exactly the time when I came to that resolution, that Andy and Ken Watson called this famous meeting in Building 50. So it turned out that through helping get this program started, I was able to do what I knew that I had to do. So actually it took 5 years to develop the program until that day, November 1st, 1973, which was the first day of Andy's tenure as director, and as he just mentioned, it was also the day on which he formally established what was called the Energy and Environment Division, which has gone through several names until today. During that period, we received very little encouragement from Washington because, as Andy mentioned, the Atomic Energy Commission really had no formal mandate to work in environmental field. In retrospect, I think the breakthrough for those folks who were volunteering their time, which they could do only temporarily, was the decision, somewhat belated, but it did happen, the decision of the then director, Ed McMillan, to give us a grant a rather generous grant from directors' funds to catalyze the development of the program. Those were the funds that made it possible for the people who were volunteering to develop this program to spend time to produce well thought through programs which might be sold to agencies in Washington, which, as Andy mentioned, primarily the agency that was responsible, and the only agency which at that time had authorization to work in this area, was the National Science Foundation. Joel Snow was indeed the head of the program, but one would be remiss not to mention the tremendous contribution that Paul Craig made in that RANN division of the National Science Foundation, which actually funded the first of several proposals from LBL. And Paul, I believe, I know he's here today. I don't know if he's still here, but he was there. Thank you, Paul Craig, for that help. The division's first years coincided with the so-called energy crisis of 1973-1974. You may recall that the Nixon administration at that time became enamored of the idea of energy independence, something that we have, if anything, as a country become further from realization even then. But because of that emphasis, our early programs tended to emphasize energy technologies, perhaps more than they would have otherwise. A side benefit of the emphasis on energy was, as Andy also mentioned, new collaborations with the Berkeley campus, and some tremendous collaborations indeed. For example, a geothermal research program was begun under the leadership of geosciences Professor Paul Witherspoon, who actually later became an LBL division head, and another program, that was the program, like I said, geothermal energy development. Another one was a program starting in chemical engineering department by Professor Charles Wilkie, having to do with the enzymatic hydrolysis of cellulosic materials to produce ethanol, which is now finally finding its way into use as at least an additive to fuel, to automobile fuel. At that time, the solar research program was started mostly by Mike Wallach, who is here, and Mel Simmons, who is unfortunately not here today. As has already been mentioned, Bob Budnitz and Dick Mack and some others started an ongoing survey of instrumentation for a measurement of trace pollutants, which instrumentation at that time was mostly very primitive compared to the state of the art today. And I'm delighted to mention that Ticha Novakov, who's here today, at that time or even before that, started what's perhaps the longest running successful research program in a division. His work, which started back in the late 60s, mid-60s to late 60s, of chemically characterizing atmospheric aerosols, particulate matter, in pollution. And that program has, in these intervening years, evolved into a worldwide recognized leader in the characterization of various kinds of aerosols and in the study of the critical role that these aerosols play in climate dynamics and climate change. This work is still ongoing and probably will prove to be very important in climate studies in the future. Another one of the early programs was stimulated by Art Rosenfeld, and that was efficient energy use, mostly in buildings, and also a parallel program started by Sam Berman, who is here today, in the area of efficient lighting. Now, most of us have compact fluorescent lights all over our houses, and this incredible transformation in this country was catalyzed, at least in part, by the work done in this division. And there's so many others that, of course, I couldn't possibly mention them all. In 1976, as Andy mentioned, I took leave from the laboratory to take residence in Washington, where I directed this big energy study called CONEUS. At that time, Bob Budnitz assumed the leadership of the division, and Bob is here, and I'm sure that he has many tales to tell about those years in the late 1970s. I'm sure he'll share some of those tales with you, won't you, Bob? But I'd like to tell just one little story that kind of illustrates the zeitgeist of those years. In 1972, Mel Simmons, who was instrumental in along with Mike Wallach, in developing the lab's solar energy research, Mel and I made one of our many trips to Washington to try to secure funding for the young program. And even though, as Andy said, the AEC wasn't overly excited by our program, we went to talk to some of the higher ups in the research division of the AEC. I won't go so far as to say that we were escorted to the door, but it was almost that. They said, just what is this solar energy that you guys are talking about? And why should the AEC have anything to do with this solar energy? Well, after this kind of question, our presentation was somewhat defensive, I must say. But after the presentation, the AEC's response was very clear that their non-military responsibility was confined to nuclear energy, practical development, and the basic research that was relevant to the development of nuclear energy. So we were rebuffed thoroughly on that visit. But it was all soon to change, because in the very same year, the famous Calvert Cliffs court decision, which some of you may know about, was a decision handed down by the court having to do with the siting of a new nuclear power plant. I think it was in Maryland, although I'm not sure, which was a controversial siting. Remember, this is 1972. And the AEC was ordered by this court order in its permit application to investigate all reasonable other energy sources in addition to nuclear energy that would be possible in that site. And in addition to that, the AEC was required to make a study of the environmental impact of that site, the nuclear plant, and all the other programs that might have been suggested. That, in fact, was the birth of the environmental impact statement as we know it today. And it was also the key that unlocked the door in the AEC to a broad, or at least broader, non-nuclear research program. Because before Calvert Cliffs, AEC was correct in saying they could not work outside the nuclear area. And after the Calvert Cliffs decision, the AEC had to say, we must work outside the nuclear area. And this, obviously, this broader program then was carried on by AEC and then by its successor agencies, which was ERDA, as Andy said, and to the Department of Energy, which still exists. I want to close with one little comment about the division's future. In retrospect, the dissenters at Andy's 1968 meeting, in which they said, stick to your knitting, were correct in principle, although they missed one detail. We were sticking to our knitting when we decided to apply the solid science and engineering of LBL to new problems. But today the situation is very different. In the last decade, in the last 3 decades, the environmental sciences have become highly politicized. And we know that government policies can be influenced as much by ideology as by hard science. And we know that policies often shift from pole to pole as the political parties change power in Washington. So one must be suspicious of science policies and science funding that follow the laws of politics rather than the laws of physics and economics. So I'd like to hark back to those dissenters at that original meeting who admonished us in 1968 to stick with our knitting at LBL. In today's terms, what that means is continue to pursue innovative science and technology, which is relatively immune to politics, but at the same time avoid the perilous waters of political correctness. Thank you.
Well, I've been told that the natives are getting restless, so we're going to ask the speakers, the next speakers, to be as brief as they possibly can. And I'm going to try to help by not giving the introductions that I intended to. And so we'll simply introduce Bob Budnitz, who became first the acting division head and later the regular division head upon Jack's departure. Bob?
Thanks. Well, I wanted to start with a memory of the very first thing that happened. After Jack and Andy and Dick Mack, and I'll speak to all 3 of those in a minute, after they circulated what became that manifesto. A whole bunch of proposals written for projects, as either I guess Andy said, or Jack, 10 out of 12 came in. The very first project that came in the door was a survey of instrumentation for environmental monitoring. Dick Mack was the principal investigator. And it came in May of 1971, but the money wasn't going to come in until August. It was 1971. The dates are important here for a minute for something I'm about to say. I had a postdoc in the physics division, and it ran out in June. I had a 2-month gap. And the physics division said, sorry, you should be aware of that. Craig Hollowell did too, but Glenn Seberg saw to it that he had that gap. So Andy went in with me to the director. This is McMillan. And McMillan said, okay, we'll fill that. If you don't remember that, Andy, I do. My life was at stake. All right? And that attitude on the part of at least some of the physics division persisted for a long while. Thank God it's over. But it was a real problem for some of us. And the end of that little story is that the first 2 employees of this division were Craig Hollowell and me. Craig died in 1982. I miss him every so often, and when I saw the pictures, I miss him a lot. I became his closest collaborator. We worked elbow to elbow for years and years, not only on the survey, but later with indoor air stuff, until I became the division head. And that first leap meant, because Jack and Andy were senior scientists, that Craig and I were taking a leap. What that meant was we weren't sure whether this would ever turn into anything. Maybe it would be 4 or 5 or 6 projects, and 3 years would pass, or even 1, and it would be over, and we'd just have to go find another job. And I had just cut my umbilical cord to the physics, not only the physics division, but the whole physics field right away. Craig had done the same. Well, it didn't happen that way, but it was a real jump. And what made that jump possible was the backing of Dick and Jack and Andy. Later on, several things came in right away, and it was clear it was going to work. But there was an issue that persisted for about half a dozen years, in which whenever the division, or first it was a program, wanted something that cost somebody else something, usually it was space. We had a hell of a time trying to find space. So we ended up with people like me and Mike Wallach in the office that we were in the physics division, or Craig in the office in the chemistry division, and Dick Mack is laughing back there, staying in the offices in which we had been in our prior life, even if we were working on the same project together. And so you'd be across the campus. It was crazy. I went back to the records and agree. When I took over in 1975, we were in 18 buildings. 18 buildings. We only had 65 people. But interestingly, when I left 3 years later, we had 210. Okay? And that's, by the way, that's what I call the E&E division, because there was all this other stuff. When the division was formed, Andy in his wisdom threw the fusion people at us, and I don't count them because they were with us for 3 years and then off they went. I wouldn't count them, although when I was there, we managed them. And of course, as I'm sure you know, we had the Earth Sciences division too. The history is really interesting. Jack left in November of 1975, and I'm sure that the powers that be tried to figure out what the hell to do, because there wasn't any obvious successor, and perhaps 6 hours later, a delegation came and sat down in my office. There were too many of them. They sat on the floor. Mike Wallach was among them, and I remember John Hart, and certainly Dick Mack was among them, and said to me that I had to be the one because there wasn't anybody else that might do this, and boy, I had no managerial experience at all. And I said, but that's nuts. I'm interested in doing science, not administration. They said, it's okay, it'll only be 3 or 6 months. So I went to see Andy, and he said, that's right, we're going to initiate a search committee right away, which Andy did. Now, there was a search committee that took 16 months and then failed. They couldn't find, and the reason was the division was too broad. They were searching for someone that was not only going to do what the E&E division was and became, but also we had fusion, we had chemical engineering, and we had all the earth sciences. So after that failure, 3 or 4 months later, Andy spun off the Earth Sciences division into its own. Witherspoon, of course, had been running that thing as its own. You know, I'm fond of saying, because I see Paul a lot, that he once worked for me, but you know, Paul never worked for anybody. Certainly not me, who was his son's age. And then sent the fusion stuff back. We spun off the Earth Sciences division, a whole lot of engineering work that was being done by people like Ted Scalise, wonderful work on the BART system, and Fred Golding doing interesting stuff, went back to engineering, and it was now a manageable size, and they started another search committee, and that took a year. And that committee found Elton, So I didn't want that job, and that 3 or 6 months stretched to just a month short of 3 years. All of which time I was acting and having a great time, and I have no complaint about it. One other interesting story is when I was stuck with that offer, and my closest friends and colleagues trying to talk me into it, I said on only one condition, and that is I got to have a deputy, and the deputy has to be the best guy I know that will work closely with me, and his name is Mel Simmons. Well, Mel was 31 and I was 35. And the first reaction was, okay, but Mel can't be a deputy director. I mean, he's 31 years old. He's a kid. By the way, I was 35 as a kid. And I said, okay, take it or leave it, and they took it. And Mel was the acting deputy, and I was the acting head of this division for all that time until finally Andy formalized it. And I have to say it was just a wonderful 3 years. We tripled and set the division on its course. But actually, the course had been set before. Now I just have one other thing to say, and it'll take a few minutes to say it, but I want to hold something up. I recently ran across, I have a slide, but I didn't make a slide out of it, so I ran across this interesting quote, which I'll show you. It says, this is from Ralph Waldo Emerson, a very seminal essay called Self-Reliance, written in the 1840s. Emerson was the first important American philosopher, not a philosopher about philosophy, a philosopher about America, about what it meant to be an American and why Americans were different from Europe and all the reasons why this great country had a future which we all know about. It says, every great institution is the lengthened shadow of a single man. Every great institution is the lengthened shadow of a single man. Now, this appeared in a science magazine, a book review that Koshland wrote about Jim Watson in Cold Spring Harbor, but it occurred to me that this is transparently true, and I had never thought about it before in my whole life, and I'm just going to explain what it means to me. First, there is absolutely no doubt that when I arrived here in '67, this institution was the lengthened shadow of Ernest Lawrence. Now, by the way, 37 years later, it isn't anymore in the same way, because the people that worked with him are gone, except a very few. But it was certainly the lengthened shadow. And by the way, the lengthened shadow speaks about how it's getting late in the day and the shadows get longer, and so the time's passed and people are older, but it's still there, and the shadow is still as clear as it ever was. This institution was, when I came, the lengthened shadow of Ernest Lawrence. Now, it's fair to say that I spent all day, by the way, before coming here with Bo Bodvarsson in the Earth Sciences Division, and I showed this to him, and I said, Bo, and he and I agree about something that he's closer to it than I, that the Earth Sciences Division is the lengthened shadow of Paul Witherspoon. There's no doubt about it. What this means, by the way, is every institution, a laboratory, a division, a culture, a group, has a culture, a philosophy, a modus operandi, a way of thinking about themselves and a way of thinking about their relationships to the broader world and the institution. And certainly the E&E division had that when I was here, and I know it continues because I've been close to a lot of people. Now, that didn't come about by accident. First, it's embedded in Lawrence's laboratory. Remember that. It's embedded. This is not some other place. It's Lawrence's laboratory, even though you wouldn't know it coming up Hearst, which is under my skin, and I had to say. And even though you wouldn't know it when you get the newsletter and it just says Berkeley Lab or you ride the buses, so I had to say that, and I will say it, even though I'm now an employee of the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Now, let me finish. Look, there's a crucial point here. This institution, the Energy and Environment Division that's now the EETD, and it had another name in between too, has a continuity of personnel. Some are here and some are new. It is the lengthened shadow of three men. Andy spoke, Jack spoke, and the third is Dick Mack. I know in my bones that the culture that started in 1971, and that in 1973 when it became a division, and in 1975, and in 1978, and all this time, is the way it is, and the spirit and the morale, and the way people think about themselves as a family, and the way they do with the rest of the laboratory, is the lengthened shadow of Jack and Andy and Dick. And everything that I saw when I came in the beginning was attractive to me because of those three men, and today remains as attractive, in part because although time has passed, and a lot of you, especially the young ones, don't even know Dick and Jack and Andy. I want to be sure that you do know that although their name isn't on this thing, the philosophy, the culture of this division stems from Andy and Jack and Dick. Thanks.
Well, again, in the interest of time, I'll take Bob's introduction of Elton as the introduction. Elton was a division director from 1978 until 1996. Easily the longest tenure of any division director we've had.
Thanks. I recognize that the time is getting late, so I'll be as brief as I can. But there are, of course, a number of important events that for the division that took place during the time that I was division head and later division director. And during that time, we experienced the presence of a number of different administrations in Washington, some of which had an important impact on the health and welfare of the division. When I arrived in September of '78, this was the Carter administration, and as many of you may remember, Carter was a strong supporter of energy issues, and the U.S. government was spending quite a few $1 billion on energy development and demonstration programs. So those were heady years for us. It was relatively easy to get large amounts of funding for, especially for energy issues, but also environmental topics. But then after I was here for just a few years, along came the Reagan administration, which had rather different ideas about energy and the government's involvement in energy issues. And as a result, the Department of Energy received rather severe funding cuts, and all of the national laboratories were having big problems with their energy-related programs. Fortunately for us, our problems were much less dominating and difficult for us than for other national labs. And through the energy and inventiveness of the people in the division, we managed to keep things together pretty well, and over the later years of that administration, we're in a growth mode again. It has been mentioned that we had some division name changes along the way. When I arrived, it was the Energy and Environment Division, the original name. Then under Dave Shirley as laboratory director, we changed the name to the Applied Science Division, and that held for several years. And then in the early 90s, after Chuck Schenck arrived as division director, it was changed back to the Energy and Environment Division. And then more recently, it has become the Environmental Energy Technologies Division. Now, during the 1980s, there was a lot going on in the division. We had a significant reorganization and established a number of new elements of the division, including the Center for Building Science, which was headed by Art Rosenfeld, the Center for Atmospheric and Biospheric Effects of Technology, and a number of new program heads were named, including Joan Daisy, Steve Selkowitz, Nancy Brown, Mark Levine, and Art, as I mentioned. We also hired one of the first ALS professors, and that was Steve Kramer, who is still with the laboratory and is still an ALS professor. We formed the CIEE, and we hired Jim Cole, who was here or is here somewhere, as the head of CIEE. And since that time, it has become a unit of the University of California as opposed to LBL, and that is continuing its vigorous operation. We went through the Tiger Team visits of the early 1990s. Many of you may remember those. That was a rather trying time with daily meetings with the Department of Energy Tiger Team members, all of this having to do with environmental health and safety. In 1991, Mike Wallig, who is here, took early retirement from the laboratory and went off to his second career with the Department of Energy. And at that time, we did not replace Mike, who was head of the solar program, and that was the ending of the solar program in its formal configuration. We named Joan Daisy as director for Cabot, and we lost to the Technology Transfer Office Cheryl Fragiadakis, who was our division administrator for several years. And then in 1993, we were proud to establish the Washington office of the Energy and Environment Division, and that office later became an LBNL Washington office and still exists as such. And during those years, there were far too many exciting research developments to mention here, but I'd like to just give a flavor of what it was like by indicating some of the research work that was done. Art Rosenfeld and Fred Winkleman and coworkers developed the DOE2 code and successor codes for energy modeling of buildings, especially houses. There was widespread recognition of the importance of indoor radon as a health issue, and a lot of research was done here, led by Tony Nero and later by Rich Sextro. It's already been mentioned Ticha Novikov's outstanding work on carbonaceous aerosols, which continues today. Rick Russo and coworkers developed high-TC superconducting thin films. Those are still being developed as tapes for superconducting cables. Low emissivity windows by Steve Selkowitz and coworkers. Robert Cheng and his coworkers developed the weak swirl burner, which has low NOx emissions and lean burn. That's being applied now and in industrial scale. We saw the development of the waterworks purification system by Ashok Gadgil and Jim McMahon and coworkers. A lot of work on appliance efficiency standards which have been put in place. And another example is the development of aerogels by Arlen Hunt. So we've had a lot of exciting research over the years. I know we're going to have a lot more, and this is a wonderful occasion to celebrate the last 30 years and look forward to the next 30 or more. Thank you.
Well, there's some other long shadows in the division, particularly in the energy efficient buildings area, Art Rosenfeld and Sam Berman. Sam is here, or was here. He's here. Art could not make it. Sam retired almost exactly 10 years ago on this date. Art retired a few years later, but Art stayed very prominent in the national level. He was a senior advisor within within Department of Energy. A couple of years ago, he became a commissioner on the California Energy Commission, and he could not be here today because he had another commitment because of that position. What Art did best when he was here and then indeed at Department of Energy and now on the California Energy Commission is stir things up, trying to get people's attention so that the nation and the state can use energy more efficiently. Today, well, Art submitted a couple of view graphs, two, which is unusual for Art, and a little bit of text, and he's going to be represented today by Evan Mills, who was Art's deputy back when Art was the head of the Center for Building Science. Evan?
So the year is 1982, and I'm a new undergraduate at UC Berkeley, following the academic career of energy efficiency. Took a deep breath, wandered into an upper division physics course about the efficient use of energy, and encountered this man, Art Rosenfeld, who was possessed with the subject. And it took a while. It took about 5 minutes of his charts about 2 photon phosphors and equations about energy balance around low E windows, and I too had the bug. And those of you who know Art at all know how infectious his enthusiasm is about the field. Some other people in that class, Marianne Piet, who may be here, and Carl Bloomstein, who I saw earlier, was not a student, but I knew something was important. There's Carl in the back. Knew something was important because neither before nor since have I seen an adult audit a graduate course at UC Berkeley. I knew something was up. And through that course, I got to meet a number of other visionaries in the field, Sam, Tony, very important inspirations to us as students. So it didn't take long, and Art invited me to jump into his VW Rabbit, which was the Prius of the day, and come up the hill to LBL. And incidentally, he's proud to say that he drives a California-issue Prius today as a commissioner. And it was Lawrence Berkeley something, but he said it was up the hill and encouraged me to come along, and I never left. I went and got a PhD in Sweden, but came back here. So let's see the first slide. You can go forward. There's his email address. Most commissioners probably don't give away their email address. That's a clue about the kind of person Art is. So in those days, Art and I would stay up frequently till 2 or 3 in the morning in his office working on plots, he called them. Not, they were all benevolent plots. And this one, those of you who've been anywhere within 1,000 kilometers of Art know these kind of charts, and he affectionately called this JAWS. And this particular version, which he's showing these days, is California versus the United States. This is electricity use per capita from the 1960s through the present. And he shows a tracking of the two areas through the time of the energy crises. And after that, the formulation of the Energy Commission and a lot of the work here, the history you've heard, and this interesting divergence. And he's quick to point out that the savings today, if California had stayed on the same track that it was on and followed in the footsteps of the country as a whole, we'd all be spending about $15 billion or so more on just electricity than we do today. Next slide, and last slide. Never seen Art give a 2-slide talk. This is some new work from his staff at the Commission showing some of the composition of those savings that have occurred. These are programs run either by utilities or by the state government and standards and utilities. And these, he say, if you add in natural gas, are worth about $5 billion a year. And I should add, plots like these were drawn, I remember in those late hours, looking down at his big desk and seeing the Atomic Energy Commission little stamp on that desk, so stories you've heard are true. So today, I think Art's main point is to crow, and in fact, he used the word we should all be gloating about our contribution to this. Art estimates, he says conservatively, that the technologies that have come out of this laboratory, and also policy support, not just hardware, but policy support from the Energy Analysis Department and elsewhere, contributed maybe 1/10 of this. And so that's looking like $500 million a year of energy savings and money savings for the state. And that's on a par with the laboratory's entire budget. So it's quite an accomplishment. I heard Art talk a couple of weeks ago, and I've never seen him so concerned about winning the battle and losing the war. And he was very concerned about keeping the momentum and enlarging the momentum, because there's still a lot of work to do. And because as we learn more about climate change, other issues, energy security, reliability, there's new reasons to do what we do. And so there's 2 parts answer to that. One is keep new technologies coming down the pipeline. We're doing that very well, of course, here. But also he was recognizing the shortage of people who have the knowledge and the ability, whether it's from the PhD researcher level or the community college graduate in the trenches, to actually go out and implement all this stuff. And I think that's something that those of you who know Art know. He was probably the leader here in our division at the laboratory during his day of making a bridge between the university and the education of young scientists and engineers, the laboratory's part of the laboratory's core mission, and the field and the practice professionally of energy management. And me, Alan Meyer, lots of people met Art as students and came up here and made careers. And I think the point is that's part 2 of what we need, is to continue to stay focused on the energy education mission and building up the ranks of people who can do this very good work going forward. Those are my remarks. Thank you.
Now, Mark Levine, our current division director, will bring today's celebration to a close. I will just mention that we have a calendar. It's actually a 2-year calendar that has historic photos of all kinds and shapes and permutations, so be sure you pick one up on the way out. Mark.
Why is it a 2-year calendar? We got together and we looked at pictures, and we just couldn't have 12 pictures. And so we were able to limit it to 24 pictures. It was actually more than 30, but somehow or other we got it down to 24, so that's why it's 2 years. Why am I here? Well, actually, I look around and realize that two of the three people who are responsible for my being at the lab are here. There's Paul Craig. Paul, you can tell by the fact that he's standing so straight and is so distinguished. Oh, well, maybe not that. Paul cornered me in an airplane, and for 5 hours I couldn't get away from him. And the 5 hours were devoted to why I should come to LBL. And that was shortly before right when I was thinking about where to go, and so he insisted on it. And then I knew Lee Schipper. Everybody knew Lee Schipper. And Lee explained to me the wonders of being both of the government and not of the government, which is true today and a wonderful thing. I'm reminded of that all the time. We can influence decisions and then run away and go back and do our work. And of course, the other person is Bob Budnitz, who regaled me with his stories of how he somehow or other was able to get me hired, able to get me a salary, and allegedly able to get me an office, although I'm not so sure about that. I think in considering the time, I won't go through the many things that have happened in 7 years. I think it's been very, very interesting to hear the early history and see the photos of the early history. One gets sort of, you get feelings as you pass 10 years and then 20 years and then 30 years and see the old photos and the folks who are still around, still energetic after all these years. And that's the wonder of the laboratory, and to my mind, the wonder of the division. If I think back on the 7 years, I've actually seen the lab in a process of remaking itself in the same way that this division was a creative enterprise at the time and an important enterprise. And over these years, I've seen divisions change, leadership change, new scientific directions. I think the laboratory is in many ways following the example of this division. I think perhaps one of the reasons that Chuck Schenck focused on the significance of this division is that as he looks at the laboratory and works with it, he sees the same sorts of things necessary to happen within the scientific side as well. You see the application of physicists to life sciences, an experiment no less radical than at the time the experiment of creating this division really was. And we see that throughout the laboratory. And so in some sense, I almost feel like we're a little bit the establishment, and the physics division and all those divisions that always were the establishment are undergoing major change. Not to say we aren't undergoing major change ourselves. And let me say a couple words. Actually, I was on an airplane today and I wrote this whole speech, which I'm not using to save time. You know, my 25-page speech is down the tubes. But we're changing ourselves, and I think we have very significant new initiatives as a division. I'll look to the future. In 3 areas, we've created entirely new activities in electricity reliability, in transport of indoor pollution, and in atmospheric processes. We've hired new, young, exciting people, and I think we're moving ahead in those areas in very significant ways. I see us moving in other important areas, and that's not in any way to minimize the work that we're doing and the main thrust of the work we are doing. In fact, if I could take a slight detour for a second, I think Bob's comment about the long shadow, I want to add Art Rosenfeld to that shadow particularly. Certainly in my case, Art basically taught me, I hope I learned, that a national laboratory was a remarkable place to do significant work, very significant work, that it could have important impacts on the world. And I think as I travel and talk to people about our division and run into people who know about our work, I think we are recognized, and we are in many ways very unusual as an institution that is committed to improving essentially the environment, largely through energy efficiency, technology and policy, also through environmental work that's related directly to that. And I think we have a mission, we have a goal, and in many ways that sets us apart. I've decided not to talk about the other areas of the future, but instead simply to say that I think there are lots of people who deserve great appreciation, whom I'm very thankful for in the time I've been here. I think all the members of Division Council have been just fantastic. We have, I think all of them have shown an enterprise and an energy that continues in spite of lots of difficulties. We keep going on. The members were initially Joan Daisy, who sadly wasn't yet in her prime when she died. Joan was getting better and better. Steve Selkowitz, Don Grether, Steve Wheel, Nancy Brown, and then Joan was replaced by Bill Fesk, and we've had Nancy Padgett and Marcy Beck. And I am extremely grateful to the work that all of those folks have done over all these years. I think from the standpoint of the division, if you think about all the group leaders, and we have more than 20, that's the backbone of the division, and all of them have performed extremely well. I would say, looking to the future, that some of us in the next 10 years are going to retire. Well, sort of. And we've been quite successful in being able to grow, and we have lots of young new folks, but that's really perhaps the biggest challenge, is to continue to seek exceptional talent in the areas that we've already established ourselves. We're really in a transition in the next 10 years where we can maintain the wonderful traditions that you've heard if and only if we continue to grow, we continue to exhibit the vitality that we have exhibited, and we seek out new people and young people who will take over that tradition and push us forward. And I think we will do that, and with that I would like to close. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for coming. Hopefully there's a little bit of food left. I haven't had any yet, and you're welcome to stick around. And again, thanks for coming.